Today we're talking about arbitrary calls. In the last few days, we've had a security incident from Leafy or Leafy. And so I'm going to talk about how this happened, but I'm also going to talk about ways to prevent it. Fundamentally, this image is impossible to see, but if you go and check the code, you'll see that as a pattern, I guess I'd call them Leafy. Leafy would call to an arbitrary address with an arbitrary payload. And apparently this is not the actual vulnerability. As in, obviously, this is why they got exploited. So for the, as the most basic explanation of what happened, Leafy was following the following approach, which I call the approval honeypot. So basically they had a contract that will receive a user approval. And then the honeypot contract would also perform a set of operations. And because of this pattern, that means that anytime you can perform an arbitrary call on the honeypot, you get wrecked anytime that happens. So the honeypot pattern is something that you should be very familiar with. If you ever work with a router, if you work with a vault, those are all honeypots. The idea of a honeypot is that you are directly interacting with it, and any compromise at that level will cause problems. So the foundational way for you to protect yourself against honeypots is to not use infinite allowance. There is literally no other option. If you as a user want to use a honeypot, that's your risk. And so the way you mitigate that risk or reduce it is by not having arbitrary allowance. In terms of how the honeypot will protect the user, we'll talk about it. But fundamentally, there is no way to both have an arbitrary address and an arbitrary call data and have user approvals being stored in the same contract. So I guess I'm gonna, come up with another trilemma, but you literally cannot have approvals plus arb address and arb data in the same contract. So these are going to be our free variables, and we'll see that as we move them, we actually end up with different patterns, and fundamentally we can solve this challenge, which if you were to take a guess as to why this is used, the answer is that this allows you to change the target anytime, and that it also allows you to change the data anytime. So there are reasons why you will want to use this pattern, but at the same time, you fundamentally can never have these free variables in the same address, because anytime you do, you're going to be screwed. And so the classic solution, if we look at something like Uniswap router, which will be the Uniswap universal router, the classic solution is to enumerate everything. I think there should be a thing called dispatch. So this is how you solve for expansion while at the same time being safe. This will be your first solution. The basic solution will be something like the Uniswap v2 router, Uniswap v3 router, where you hard code the pairs, you hard code the factory, and you verify them. And the more advanced solution will be something like the universal router, which is still fundamentally just a if-else, just to get a bunch of operations. And it fundamentally allows you to do a set of operations that are still not allowing you to sweep other tokens. So you should not see a transfer from that moves the tokens from somebody else to you. So you can see that anytime you see a transfer from in Uniswap, they never transfer from a random address. That's because that will be a key vulnerability. And so that's one way of solving the issue, is basically hard code options and basically not expose the dangerous options fundamentally. But this is not the only way. There are many more. But fundamentally, this is where you should start. So anytime you see an arbitrary call with an arbitrary address, this is the first thing you should think about, is that it should never, have user allowances. And anytime there's an allowance, you should go for a set of reduced options. So you can only have a certain amount of commands, and they are fundamentally clamped. So another option, which is something that was explored by the OX protocol, and it's also something that is explored by CowSwap. It's a bit difficult to show you in the code, but fundamentally what they do is they separate the allowance from the execution. What does this mean? This means that they have a allowance contract that allows you to send your tokens or approve your tokens, and instead their contract that performs the execution can perform execution on an arbitrary address with arbitrary data, simply because it never has the ability to transfer from tokens. And so that's the key aspect that you want to look into, is the idea that you could actually have this free, but if we look at the first option, the Uniswap option, we fundamentally removed the arbitrary data and the arbitrary addresses. So that's what they did. If we look at the CowSwap option instead, we fundamentally remove the approvals from the equation, but we keep the arbitrary address and the arbitrary data. So that's an alternative that tends to be safe and that you can actually use many times. The way you would build something like this would be that you would have a contract, which will be the user entry, and you would actually receive the approvals from here. And then you would have some sort of a function to start. You will do whatever, and then anytime you need to perform an arbitrary call, you will directly transfer the tokens. You will never have a pending approval. You will always transfer, and then you will perform the arbitrary calls in the execution contract. So by doing that, you make it so that this contract will probably have some extra overhead, such as approvals, having to set some variables. You may risk, leaving tokens there, but fundamentally, because you never approve it, this contract can never steal from you. You can only lose the stuff that you send it, and so you will then enforce checks here, which is what CowSwap does, where it fundamentally allows you to do whatever you want, and then it asks you to solve the specific order so that the user receives what they signed. And so those are two key ideas. We're gonna check it in a moment. I'm gonna come back, but basically these are the two key ideas that you wanna think about, is that an arbitrary call is not a vulnerability per se. An arbitrary address is not a vulnerability per se. It becomes a vulnerability anytime you have an approval because that means that you can steal other people's tokens. And so you want to think about this honeypot risk and how that ties into. So the separating the transfer, the execution tends to be the way in which you can effectively have a arbitrary address and arbitrary data, and it tends to be the cleanest of all the scenarios, with the additional complexity that your user entry needs to validate certain parameters, and so it effectively needs to have some sort of way to defend against what the execution contract does. So this is why this can become dangerous, and fundamentally, like, you want to think of building something like this as investing like $1 million in security for you to be able to do something like this, whereas something that tends to be cheaper and tends to be safer would be something like what we did, or actually something like what Tapioca did, where Tapioca did a pattern where they would allow you to have an arbitrary, and I think we did it at Ledger as well, with the leverage ZAP. But basically, we would allow you to have arbitrary data. We would allow you to have the honeypot risk with approvals, but we would not allow you to have an arbitrary address. The address will be hard-coded. And so the main advantage with following this pattern is that once you hard-code the address, you can just validate that whatever router is safe and will not have another payer. It will not sweep tokens from other people. And so fundamentally, by hard-coding the address, all you have to verify is that whatever you're integrating into will always transfer from you. And so as long as it transfers from you, it means that it cannot steal tokens. That's again because the main risk in having the execution as the honeypot is that the honeypot can move other people's tokens in an unintended way. And so separating that honeypot risk and that arbitrary transfer risk from the actual rest of the operations fundamentally makes the code safe. So I'm gonna show another pattern, but let's see the question I got in the chat here. So if it's only an issue if the contract allows both arbitrary address and arbitrary data, isn't it? As I said, that's actually not the fundamental issue. You fundamentally can have, you can never have all three, but you should be able to have all of the combinations. I'll make sure to go over all of the possible combinations in this workshop, but fundamentally we showed how this is unsafe, the honeypot is unsafe. Basically, imagine if you had, because what is this, by the way? What is this honeypot with arbitrary address, arbitrary data, arbitrary approval? This will be like having a Gnosis safe that everybody owns, with no owner, basically, that everybody is the owner. That's literally what that is, because you're basically saying whatever is in there I can move, whatever is approved to me I can move, so I'm gonna steal everything. And so that's why there's this risk, and that's why this is not necessarily dangerous though, because if your nose is safe that everybody owns, never receives any tokens, because you separate your start contract with the nose is safe, then you can imagine that here only you can send your own tokens because there's a message.sender check. Then here there is no approval, so the way the tokens will flow is they are transferred to the nose is safe, and then the nose is safe can move everything. And so this is making it so that instead of interacting with a router directly, with a dangerous router that has arbitrary calls, we are separating the approval area and the beginning of the execution from the actual contract that performs the arbitrary calls. So as long as you can isolate the risk and separate it, you will have other issues, because let's say you do a swap and it's inaccurate and now you need to send the tokens back. So there's always complexity, but at the same time, you no longer can lose all of your money, because this contract can no longer transfer your tokens away. And so the types of tests that you will want to write whenever you have this pattern will be that you will always have something like a end of turn or end or like invariant check. And this invariant check will basically, you know, for each actor, transfer their tokens away. And so anytime you can transfer somebody else's tokens away, you've introduced the mixture of the arbitrary data, the arbitrary address, and the approval. And so now you're in danger. Whereas anytime you can isolate that approval risk, that's no longer an issue. Because if you think about it from a bug bounty or a security perspective, if you have a router and you send the tokens to the router, you expect to lose them. You're not expect to send tokens randomly to a router. And so that's the same idea. You're not expected to give the approval to effectively this arbitrary router. You're supposed to instead use a macro that starts your contract, that starts your calls, sends them to the router, performs the operation, and then you receive your funds back. And so if that's not clear, feel free to drop another comment. But fundamentally, that's the key idea. The key idea is always going to be that you cannot have all three. So going back to the examples here, we have the hard-coded option. Fundamentally, you only have the approval. So it's safe by enumeration. It's safe because you found all of the options. The separate allowance from execution, you don't have the allowance risk. So it's safe not by enumeration, but it's safe by default because it assumes that this is dangerous and it basically creates a quarantine to protect you here. And then the intermediary solution is one in which you hard code the address and then you have the other two options as separate. So the last option will be to have any address and the arbitrary data. And so I don't think I've ever seen that. Actually, I have. I'm gonna tell you a story about this. But the last combination, I'm gonna take the image. The last possible combination will be one in which we have the approval, we have the data, and the address, or rather we have the address and the data is hard-coded. So basically you would have some sort of a function signature. So this is interesting because I've only seen this once, and it was part of the greatest DeFi video ever made. I've repeatedly made the joke. If you ever watch only one video, it's gonna be the DeFi MOOC video from Sam. DeFi Lecture 12, Practical Smart Contract Security. So this is basically, if you ever only watch one video for the rest of your life, go watch this one. But fundamentally in this video, there's the famous pickle finance exploit. And the pickle finance exploit is based on the idea that if you can put tokens in the contract that is gonna perform the arbitrary signature, then you can steal all of the funds. And that's because what's happening is that if you have a contract that has the user allowances, has a arbitrary address, but it doesn't have a arbitrary signature, then that means that you're not going to be able to do the elementary school type exploits that is happening, which is basically ERC20.transfer, right? Just repeatedly steal tokens. What you would have to do instead is you would have to find a way to get the tokens in the router, and then you would simply have a malicious implementation that would transfer the tokens away from this router into the malicious contract. And so that's the example of what was called the evil pickle jar exploit. But fundamentally, this type of confirmation, this type of setup is not something you see typically. because it has most of the downsides of having an arbitrary address, which means that you cannot verify how it works. And it has the downside of having a arbitrary signature, which means that it's fundamentally not a great idea. And so when it comes to immutable setups, these are going to be your options. So now I'm going to talk to you about the leverage macro, which is something I wrote for Badger a while back. And fundamentally, I'm going to talk to you about how I tried to build something more reusable, but I ended up, in order to make it safer and simpler to audit and faster to code and simpler to review, I ended up changing everything at the last second. So this is the eBTC protocol. If you go in the repo, you can find something called the leverage macro. And the leverage macro has multiple layers. There's the reference target, there's a bunch of stuff. But fundamentally, the leverage macro is a contract that once you call do operation, it allows you to take a flash loan in the do operation. So I'm just gonna chunk it up into pieces so you can see how it works. But basically, it will allow you to do a transfer of tokens. It will then allow you to do a flash loan. And the flash loan will have a callback, but you can assume that in the flash loan something happens. And then lastly, it will have some checks, and it basically will send the tokens back. So that's fundamentally what it is. So in the example of a router, if you think about it, this is a lot closer to what the Uniswap router looks like, where you can only straight transfer from yourself. You can take the flash loan for yourself, or maybe to somebody else, but basically for yourself. And then you're gonna have checks that are fairly hard-coded, and then you're gonna have tokens that are sent back. And then the dangerous thing that I added here was the swap, which was an excessively safe call. And so you can see that I ended up putting this arbitrary swap here, which is a pretty scary thing to do. And I put it there so that we wouldn't have to perform a lot of maintenance, etc. And we would have to change it. And so initially, what I did was I add a single contract that everybody would have access to. And basically, it would, you would approve. You will do whatever. You will take a flash loan. And then you would have this arbitrary call here. And because we had the arbitrary call, people could basically take a flash loan for 1 unit or something like that, and they could basically use the arbitrary call to move other people's tokens to repay it, or to move other people's tokens to steal all of them. And so it fundamentally was not safe. So that's how I found out about this pattern. I basically was building it. So what I did in the second iteration was I separated the starting contract. So I would have some sort of a leverage macro starter, and then the flash loan will be performed in another contract. And so the issue with something like that was that you basically would have a hard time with approving a separate contract for it to open the CDP for you. That's why we ended up creating something called the position manager. But fundamentally, without a position manager, having these multiple contracts set up meant that this flash loan taking position would actually end up owning the CDP. And so this also wouldn't work. And so the reason why this was not bad, though, was that this would actually allow an arbitrary call without having any allowance. And so it would actually support some of the use cases, but it also ultimately ended up falling short due to difficulty in auditing, difficulty in review, and complexity in coding it. And so in order not to use the position manager, in order just to keep it easy, because at the time we didn't have the position managers when we built it, we ended up making it a lot simpler, and we ended up just having a factory. we ended up having a factory, and then through the factory, you will deploy your own leverage macro. And obviously, once you deploy your own leverage macro, it's your contract. We don't care what you do. You can do whatever you want. And so while obviously this is a, almost backing off from a engineering risk, like I took a step back and I wrote something safer. But that's, I guess that's just the wisdom of the engineer, is knowing when to write something a little safer, a little simpler, so that other people can integrate it and so other people can use it. So that's kind of the, hopefully shed some light into a few of the patterns. And I'm going to talk about some alternatives as well next, tied to effectively having upgradability, which is the reason why you would have this pattern in the first place. But let's see if we have any question left. Seems like that's not the case. So in my head, I know that I could have rewritten the leverage macro in a different way. And so the fundamental ways in which we could have written it will be obviously to hardcode this address, which is how it was built for the leverage ZAP, for the eBTC leverage ZAP. That's what we ended up doing at Badger, what James wrote. We basically hard-coded the address so that you couldn't steal tokens. And so I think that's fundamentally the best way to always handle these types of scenario. And the way you would add upgradability there is that fundamentally, if you can change this address, it's literally equivalent to upgrading the contract to work with something else. The main difference is you may also need to have accessory swaps. So it's almost never that easy that you can only do one swap or one operation. But fundamentally, if you could simply yoink away this code and turn it into some sort of a transfer to another contract, and then in the other contract you will do a sequence of arbitrary calls, then you basically have achieved the same goal of having a upgradable setup where you can support any address or you can support any type of call data, and you also reduce your surface area to just those few lines. The main issue you will see though is that if you mess those up, because you're doing a singleton pattern where fundamentally either you have separated the allowances or you didn't, and so if you did not separate the allowances, then messing these few lines up could still end up causing a complete loss of funds. So that's why if you're going to go for some sort of an upgradability pattern, it may be best to instead separate the contract that does the arbitrary call and then use some sort of a beacon proxy pattern where the contract that are deployed, you can basically change their logic through a beacon, and that means that you can upgrade all of them, but now you're separating each of them into a separate contract. So you're basically making it so that they are a bit safer. Whereas as the user, you basically should always use some sort of a hard-coded allowance. You should never use infinite allowance, simply because this type of exploits can happen, and you fundamentally can only avoid them if you didn't grant the allowance. So every other option eventually falls short. So I guess to summarize ideas for upgradability, the first idea would simply be having a setter for the address. The second one will be to have a set of transfer to settable address. So you basically would implement the separation between the allowance and the execution. You will basically separate that, and then you will make that executing contract a separate contract that you change over time, versus having the ability of effectively just changing that address. And so these two tend to be the best options when you do not care, when you want security over optimization. because if you want to optimize, you will most likely have to change the address, because sometimes matcha is faster than 1 inch, sometimes 1 inch is better than cowswap, etc. So sometimes cowswap is worse than Uniswap or something. Most of the times it's not, but like because of that, you may end up needing that arbitrary call. And so anytime you end up needing the arbitrary call, this is really the pattern that you gotta go through. Basically, you have to separate the allowances and leave the arbitrary execution as separate. And obviously, you still are potentially subject to forging messages so that funds can still be stolen. So these are kind of the main ideas. I'm gonna end today with a teaser of something I was working on the last couple of days. It's called the macro ERC20. This is one. This is the 20th idea. Just another token standard, I guess. But the idea that I had was that fundamentally, you need to have this setup where you need the macro. Like if we go back to nose is safe, so let's think about nose is safe. Let's think about multi-call. And then we have account abstraction. So what is account abstraction at the end of the day? It's just a way to do sponsored transactions and do macros, basically, which is basically multi-call. So it's just a way for you to own those multi-calls. So at the end of the day, if you had a nose is safe that paid gas in USDC, which I think you can do it without all of the extra EAPs, you're basically experiencing account abstractions today without much difference. And so my 2 cents were that in many scenarios, most of the issues with tokens are that you have to do the allowance. And because you have to do the allowance, you would opt to have an infinite allowance. Whereas if you were to be able to call your token and have your token set the approval and then do whatever swap and then return whatever thing, then you wouldn't need to have to deal with that. You wouldn't need to deal with all of these allowances. You would simply call the token, do whatever, and be done. Just like if you own a nose is safe, you just call the nose is safe, and then inside of the nose is safe transaction, you would have the approve, the swap, the transfer, and the canceling of the approval. And so fundamentally, if there's anything you're gonna take away from our chat today is go use a nose is safe. If you don't, just use a nose is safe by default. There's no reason not to. It costs maybe extra 10 cents per transaction, but every time you use them, you're gonna be safer. So that's something to think about. But the other idea is what I built here with this macro ERC20, which is basically an open Zeppelin ERC20 that has this function called replace caller, which basically hard codes the caller into the first parameter of any call that is passed to it. There are other ways to do this. You could append it as the end of the call data, but this is a simpler solution. But fundamentally, what you can do with a contract like this is that you can have a function that allows you to forward this data to any target. And once you write something like this, where if you call yourself, you're going to delegate call, and you're going to set this forwarded sender, which uses this overridden message.sender to keep, to remind itself who the message.sender was, which is basically a way to multi-call a transfer and approve, and etc. So now you can do multiple transfers by just calling the token or approve. And then you also add this do the macro call, which basically allows you to specify a target, some data, and whether you want to check for success. Well, now you can basically do a delegate call to the token to approve the, let's say, a phantomatic, an hypothetical vault. And then from approving the vault, you will basically interact with the vault, and then you will reset your allowance. That's exactly what I wrote here in a test as a demo. But basically, I wrote that you would encode that you want to mint the token, you want to approve the token, and then you want to deposit it into a vault. So now if you do that, there are risks, obviously. The risk will be obviously also the risk of my token being wrong, but the main risks will be that you may have allowance open in the middle of the call. But at the end of the day, by doing something like this, you always start with a zero allowance, then you set it to a non-zero, and then you do whatever you need to, and then at the end you set the allowance back. So if anything, what I hope this presentation showed you is, on one end, that the main problem is never just the arbitrary address or arbitrary call. It's the fact that you have an allowance on top of that. That's the main issue, is commingling of honeypot with arbitrary execution instead of having a compartmentalized allowance, like a separated setup. And then you can also think about how in trying to solve that type of issue, you could also end up writing something closer to this that effectively allows you to sidestep the issue by making sure that you always have a zero allowance, but at the same time making it so that you still can do everything in one transaction. So hopefully this inspires you to write your own new ERC standard, go flood the EIPs on Ethereum. But most importantly, consider the idea that you can have safe arbitrary calls. They are done in a lot of projects, but they're done because they're done with intentionality. So anytime I can steal your tokens, that's dangerous. You gotta find a way to separate the ability to steal from the ability to do the interesting calls. So hopefully this helps. I'm gonna answer a couple of questions and then we're gonna wrap it up. Alex, can you explain how it would be an issue if the contract that people approves that accepts arb address? Well, the typically doesn't have any arb data, making this whole attack vector useless. Okay, well, that's not the case. As I said in the DeFi lecture 12, basically, if you, I think it's obvious what I said about the arbitrary data and address. If you have both, let's say I'll call it D for data and A for address. So if you have both, then I can just call token dot transfer. Basically, I'll just call transfer, and you stole your tokens. Let's say I remove the ability to have the address, but I still have the ability to have the data. Well, now I've created a subset of scenarios where I can still steal all of your money. So if this contract is giving me allowance, because that's the foundational idea, is that if you hardcode the data, you will basically grant me allowance, then I cannot steal from the user, but I can still steal all of the tokens that are here. So I'm gonna show you this image. I want you to think about it for a couple of minutes. Again, I cannot steal from the user, but I can steal from here, and this is the address. And then I'm gonna invite you to go and do the Ventra digital. Let's see which one I wrote. Race 20. Let's see if I can find my own quiz that I did. '27. There you go. Go and do this and check that exact idea. The idea that as long as you grant me the ability to transfer from here, then all I have to do is have the tokens here. So it is safer than the other option, but this is still not necessarily safe. And so if you go watch the Samsung video, that's going to be the hint for that race. I highly recommend you watch that video, but also think about how the fact that you have a hard-coded signature doesn't prevent me from doing a transfer from. So at that point, we do have some extra constraints, but it's still not necessarily safe. Whereas a setup where you separate the transfer and the execution then it's always safe. The only way it's not safe is that if the arbitrary data is obviously sending the token somewhere else instead of doing the swap. But as long as I have a check here, this pattern is always safe. Whereas that pattern, like this one, is actually not always safe. There are many ways in which you actually end up losing. If you can accept the arb address, you can still steal tokens as long as you have allowance and tokens. So it reduces the chances, but it doesn't make it impossible. And so it's just something to think about, is that you there's basically two philosophies in car making, car manufacturing. One philosophy is that you need to maintain the car, and if you don't follow the instructions, the car breaks. That's the German philosophy. And then there's the Japanese philosophy that says that it assumes that you're gonna fuck up, you're not gonna maintain the car, and so we will make it so that the car is easier on you and it doesn't explode if you stop maintaining it. And so that's the same idea with the smart contracts. You can, you should be safe with the arbitrary address and the data, but in some cases you are not. And so if you go by first principles, you shouldn't rely on that, and you should instead focus on a different architecture that is safe by default. Don't focus on something that is safe by committee, safe by review. Focus on a pattern that is safe by default. And a pattern that transfer and checks is safe by default, whereas a pattern that assumes the color is benign is not. So that's something to investigate further, and hopefully in the future we'll see better examples of this. Although my advice will be for you to go and check the cow swap solver, which is a great example of a contract that has basically zero checks, and yet it's still safe because of that idea that it would separate the allowances and then it would enforce the checks at the end, similarly to what Euler has done more recently. So with that said, thank you for attending the office hours. Have an amazing weekend, and I'll see you next Thursday. Have an awesome one.